So there's a good thing about going last on a conference like this and a bad thing. The bad thing is that it's, the standard is very high and it's a hard act to follow, someone like Adrian and some of the other wonderful talks we've had. The good thing is one has an opportunity to thank the organizers on behalf of all the speakers, so please join with me in thanking them for wonderful, including Amanda, who's out there and who's done a lot of the organization, which has really been wonderful. All of the organization. So what I want to do in this talk is sort of reflect in a very simple and abstract, sort of high-level way some of the issues which strike me as important that are raised by the the empirical work that we've seen over the last couple of days, and try and bring some of that work into connection, into dialogue with some issues that are familiar to philosophers and have occupied philosophical attention over the last couple of decades. And part of my aim is to encourage philosophers, especially young philosophers looking for research topics, to get interested in this stuff, because there's so much more that philosophers can contribute to it. There hasn't been a great deal of philosophical attention to this work, and there's I think, a real need for that. And let me start by giving you the framework that I employ for thinking about consciousness. It's not quite the framework that Nico or Steve Laurie's presented yesterday morning. Whether it's meant to be doing the same thing is an interesting question. But anyway, here's how I think about things. So we have consciousness, consciousness per se, you might say. What I'm often tempted to call creature consciousness, although that term is used by different people in different ways. It's just the property of being conscious. I've got the property, the selectron doesn't. And consciousness is, of course, articulated in various ways. So there's conscious perception, there's conscious affect, there's conscious thought, and there's various distinctions we can make within each of these categories. Philosophers tend to call these things fine-grained states of consciousness. The clinicians, the neuroscientists use the word states for other things. They tend to call these things the contents of consciousness. Philosophers tend to think of these things as individuated by appeal to these contents, but they would say it's a category mistake to call those contents themselves. And then, of course, there are other things in the middle. Let's just call them things for now. Normal wakefulness, REM, dream states, minimally conscious states, hypnosis, so on and so forth. Various states of being under light sedation, light anesthesia. What do we call these things and how to think about them is, I think, an important question. Well, two questions that are related. Some people call them background states of consciousness. That's a term that Dave used in some of his NCC papers. They've been called levels of consciousness here, and that's the standard way to refer to them in the clinical literature. I don't like levels talk, and I'm going to get to that in a second. I think it's problematic. This is one of my hobby horses. I tend to call them modes of consciousness. I think it's a more neutral, less sort of laden term. And in work with Jakob Hovey at Monash University, I've started to try and think about what modes of consciousness might be. I put that not to draw attention to my own work, but there is very little out on modes of consciousness. And the questions we raise, I think, are things that philosophers might usefully contribute to thinking about. Why don't I particularly like levels talk? Well, there's three reasons, and let me briefly mention them. For one thing, it suggests an ordering of modes, and I'm not sure that modes can be strictly ordered. But let's think about what an ordering might look like and why it might not obtain. So suppose you have on one axis contents, and by that I mean the range of contents that an organism is capable of entertaining, conscious contents, so conscious states. And down here we have a creature that's not able to entertain conscious contents at all. As we go up, it becomes able to entertain a wider range of more sophisticated conscious contents. So down the bottom we might have simple sensory states. Towards the top we might have complicated states of self-consciousness. And let's just pretend it's a fiction, of course, but there's a sort of some ordering can be given here. And suppose we have consuming systems, what the creature can do with its conscious states, the kind of cognitive operations that it can deploy using the contents that it has, using the conscious states that it has. One way to think about levels talk is that you have organisms on this dimensional axis, on this diagonal axis here, that when you're unconscious, you're right down there, you've got no conscious content, and none of your consuming systems are switched on. Normal alert wakefulness is way up the top, and the different modes, REM, minimally conscious state, various kinds of epileptic states, can be plotted on the diagonal, and that's why we can call it levels, because there can be an ordering here. I think this picture is sometimes implicit in some of the clinical work. But I suspect that when we look at things, actually the modes, let's not worry about what modes we're talking about, but there are going to be modes that are kind of messy regions within this space. And if that's right, then the question is mode B higher than mode D? Well, there might be more complex contents here, but there might be more consuming systems switched on in mode D. So if you're really sticking with levels talk, it's not clear that you can order mode B relative to mode D. I mean, you've got to order them relative to one dimension. So that's one reason why I'm not keen on levels talk. It suggests a strict ordering, and I think it's very likely to turn out that, at least if you're using those axes, there won't be a strict ordering. Second reason is it suggests that consciousness itself comes in degrees. And you find this explicitly in the work of Santios Tononi. It goes from talking about levels of consciousness to saying that creatures down here are less conscious than creatures up here. And I think that's problematic. They might be conscious of less, in the sense that the contents might be, they might have fewer contents in consciousness, and they might have the capacity to be conscious of less. But being conscious of less is not the same thing as being less conscious. That seems to me a problematic way of putting things. And the third reason I'm not keen on levels talk is because levels seem to be used in two ways in the literature. So here's a picture that comes from Steve's work, and a few people have used it today. One way to think about levels is this diagonal, which is roughly speaking the line I've been talking about. But then you see on this picture, that axis is called level of consciousness. So level gets used in two ways, and I think that's problematic. So anyway, I prefer to talk about modes, but I'm going to slip back into levels talk because that's the way people speak. But I do prefer modes. Okay, what are we interested in when we're talking about problems of measuring borderline states of consciousness? Well, to go back to my taxonomy here, or the way of thinking about things, we've got three possibilities. We could be interested in measuring consciousness per se, creature consciousness, if you like. We could be interested in this, or we could be interested in the contents. And of course, I think we're going to be interested in all of these things, right? Any one of these things. Sometimes we're going to be primarily interested in the question, is this organism, is this person conscious? Sometimes we're going to want to know, are they in a particular conscious state rather than another one? But that raises the question, how is the measurement of one aspect of consciousness, one dimension, if you like, related to the measurement of other aspects? Well, here's a beguiling thought, based on how you might think the metaphysics of these things goes. You might think that the primary thing that you're going to measure is always going to be a content of consciousness. You first justify the ascription of a particular conscious state to an organism, and then, because it follows of necessity that if you're in a conscious state, a particular fine-grained conscious state, if you've got a conscious content, you must be conscious, you can infer that the creature's conscious. So you always start there. Methodologically speaking, that's the primary thing you start with, and then you go to consciousness. I think that's kind of a beguiling thought, at least I find it a plausible way in with these issues. But there are a couple of complications that I think it's worth noting, worth drawing attention to. One is that the kind of evidence needed for the ascription of a particular conscious content to a creature depends on whether or not one has reason, independent reason, to think that that creature is conscious. So let me just flesh that idea out a little by referring to Adrian's the data from his mental imagery task. And no, I'm not going to talk about his interpretation. I'm just using the data to make a slightly different point than the one he wants to make. Suppose you have this kind of evidence, and you don't know that it was produced by a command. So you don't know the environmental context in which it was generated. If you know that these are controls and that they're normal, non-brain damaged individuals who are likely to be conscious, then that kind of information about what sometimes gets called the core NCCs or differentiating NCCs might underwrite the ascription of a particular conscious content, because you kind of assume as a background assumption that there's likely to be consciousness. Creature consciousness is a plausible assumption. But when you're dealing with severely brain damaged patient, someone who's clinically VS, you can't make that assumption. So just appealing to that kind of information may not be enough to underwrite the ascription of the conscious content. So here's another way to put that point. If you really do have evidence that there's a conscious content, then you can go up to consciousness. But in many cases, background information about the likelihood of creature consciousness is going to be epistemically relevant. So there's a sort of interesting interplay, I think, between these two things that it's easy to overlook. Could there be evidence for the existence of consciousness per se, or creature consciousness, that doesn't go via some sort of inference from a particular conscious content? Well, here I think it's interesting to reflect on the study that Marcelo talked about yesterday, where, if I understand it correctly, the claim is that this is a way, it's a way of indexing, it's a measurement of creature consciousness that doesn't go by way of an ascription of a particular conscious state, a fine-grained conscious state, a conscious content. Right? We don't have information about what kind of conscious state the person's in, but we've got good evidence that they're conscious. So I might not have understood the study properly, but the way I heard it was that that was the interpretation that was being put on that study. Okay, so that's all I want to say about the framework, and some of the ways in which the framework might illuminate some of the methodological issues that we face in thinking about these cases. I want to turn now to thinking about difficult cases and what I call optimism and pessimism in thinking about the measurement of consciousness. So we're not doing the problem of other minds, we're doing, as it were, the scientific problem of other minds, we're not doing the philosophical problem of other minds. So we know that normal, conscious human beings who are alert, responsive to the environments are conscious. Right? Those are the good cases. We know that bricks are unconscious. Those are easy cases for the absence of consciousness. And there are lots of creatures, also iPhones. iPhones are intuitively, pre-theoretically unconscious. And there are lots of cases where we're not quite sure about what to say. Cases that are pre-theoretically difficult cases. Animals of certain species, the fetus at certain stages of development perhaps, and of course patients in disordered states of consciousness or cases of anesthesia. And the question for us as theorists, as philosophers, is can we go beyond our pre-theoretical or intuitive ways of measuring consciousness to address the difficult cases? That, I take it, is sort of the primary question. And there are people, some of whom are in the room, who are in print as saying yes, and there are people, some of whom are in the room, are in print as saying no. And there's there's principled reasons to think we can't ever escape the pre-theoretical, intuitive place that we start. I'm going to come back to this issue, or at least I'm going to work my way up to tackling that question head on by talking about Adrian's work, which is sort of, for me, a nice way into thinking about this question. So Adrian talked about his mental imagery task in the more recent Hitchcock study. The point I want to make, I think, can be made with reference to the Hitchcock study, but I'm just going to talk about the original tennis study because it's a bit more straightforward. So here's the slide that he put up. There's different ways to interpret how you get from this kind of data to an ascription of consciousness. I'm going to focus on the interpretation that Adrian just gave, and I've also talked about and defended in print. And the question I want to ask is, does the study, according to that interpretation, as opposed to other interpretations, go beyond our pre-theoretical ways of measuring consciousness? And my answer is kind of yes and kind of no. It does in a certain way and it doesn't in others. So here's the interpretation that I think Adrian just gave and that I would take as the best interpretation. The neuroimaging data indicate that the patient was following the instructions given to her. Instruction following is good evidence of consciousness. Doesn't mean it's decisive, but it's good evidence. So the patient was conscious. Now you might ask, what exactly is the content that's being in play here? Is it awareness of the stimulus? Is it awareness, of the primitive acoustical properties of the stimulus? Is it awareness of the meaning of the command? Is it awareness of her action? Is it awareness of the mental imagery that's generated by her activity? Lots of good questions. However, the result, I think, some version of two is going to be the leading interpretation of the study. Now, most of the discussion of this argument has focused on one, and whether the reverse inference is really valid. And I think there's lots to say here. I think one can be given a very, very good defense. the point I want to draw attention to is two. Insofar as this argument relies on that premise, we're really still sticking with our pre-theoretical measures of consciousness. We're kind of going on beyond them and using the neural response as a proxy. That's the sense in which we're going beyond the pre-theoretical measure. The sense in which we're sticking with it is we're still relying on an instruction following, which is a pre-theoretical measure of consciousness. So, I think Adrian's work, the kind of work he's doing, pushes us beyond our pre-theoretical measures, so it gives us a qualified kind of optimism, but there are lots of open questions, some of which were sort of raised by his talk. What about individuals that don't satisfy any of the markers that we pre-theoretically take to be evidence of consciousness? What about individuals that satisfy some of these markers but don't satisfy other markers that we think might be pre-theoretically necessary for consciousness? And to what degree, and this is really the core of the issue, can we rely on what we take to be pre-theoretical markers of consciousness being markers of consciousness? Right? We might think instruction following is, but as Ned raised in connection with the talk this morning on anesthesia, it's not obvious that everyone's going to agree with that, and it's certainly not clear how strong that evidence is. So we need something more. So that leads me on to the natural kind method. So here I'm drawing on a paper I wrote with Nick Shea a few years ago, asking about how we might think about validating measures for the study of consciousness. Here is Nick. And the idea is really Nick's more than mine, and he's developed it in some detail in this paper in PPR with the phrase methodological encounters with the phenomenal kind. The focus of that paper is Ned Block's work on interpretation of the Sperling studies and related experiments, but the same idea applies here, I think. So we could take this approach to address each of these things. We could take the natural kind method to focus on modes or particular contents. I'm going to just talk about it in connection with consciousness per se, because it just makes it easier, but the method generalizes across each of these aspects of consciousness. And my way into explaining the method and thinking about the problems it faces is through thinking about not consciousness as such, but the concept of consciousness. So the question I want to put on the table is really this: what kind of concept is consciousness? All right, what kind of concept is consciousness? One picture that's out there in the literature, you might call it deflationary conception of the concept of consciousness, a deflationary approach. So think about the concept of a sofa or the concept of a friend. You might think in grasping those concepts, you've got a grip on the essential nature of what they are, or what the referent is. Right? Having a grip on the concept of a sofa tells you what sofa is. Having a grip on the concept of a friend tells you what friendship is, what it is to be a friend. Applying this idea to consciousness gives you something like this kind of story. Here's an example of how you might be a deflationist about the concept of consciousness. You might think being conscious is just having information about one's external or internal environment that's available for the intentional control of thought or action. Roughly speaking, something in the ballpark of what Ned's called access consciousness. So people who say there is no conceptual daylight between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness are, by my book, adopting something like a deflationary conception of consciousness. And in some moods, Dennett will say things like that. Now, if you've got that view, there's a sense in which the difficult cases aren't really that difficult, because you just have to ask whether this patient, for example, has information about her internal or external environment that's available for these cognitive operations. That's all there is to say, because their concept of consciousness is exhausted by that. There's nothing more. There's no depth to it in a certain kind of way. So I take it that to the extent that one thinks knowing that doesn't settle questions about the existence of consciousness in anesthesia or people who are behaviorally vegetative state, if that's your response, then that indicates that your concept of consciousness isn't deflationary. There's a lot more to say about why you might resist a deflationary treatment of the concept of consciousness, but it makes these questions too easy in a way. So, if we don't have a deflationary conception of the concept of consciousness, how should we think about it? Well, you might think about it on a model of water or hepatitis, for example. Natural kind concepts. So roughly speaking, and this is familiar territory to many of the philosophers here, unfamiliar to others perhaps, you might associate the concept of water with some kind of description or descriptive content, and take that, not to give you the reference or give you the essence of water, but take that to be something that you can use to point towards what the referent is. For example, H2O. A familiar kind of picture in philosophy. And if that's your model for the concept of consciousness, if you're thinking about a natural kind concept, then you might say consciousness refers to whatever it is that underlies or explains the features with which it's pre-theoretically associated. And using that, you might think you've got some sort of grip on how you might go about studying consciousness. So you start with a treatment of the concept as a natural kind concept, and roughly speaking, distilling a lot of bells and whistles that Nick puts together in his papers. What you might do is you collect the various features associated with consciousness. You look for nomological clusters between them, tight associations between them, and then you identify consciousness, or at least if you want to leave the door open for a kind of dualism, the psychofunctional basis or consciousness with the underlying explanation of those clusters, on the model of looking at the underlying basis of the pre-theoretical markers that you associate with hepatitis or with water. And it's not a crazy view because it looks like consciousness is a biological concept. And biological concepts look to be natural kind concepts. I mean, hepatitis, things like that. And so I think there's ways of motivating it. Certain people in the room are shaking their head at this point, but it's not a crazy view. I won't name names. They may or may not be identical with David Chalmers. So what might you do sort of practically? Well, it's going to be incredibly messy. It's going to be incredibly complicated. Here's a slide that I quite like, which is relevant at this point. It's from a study, a review study by Blumenfeld of epilepsy patients, and at the top of it's cut off. But it's it's a survey of the executive behavioral functions that are impaired in absent seizures in epilepsy. So here's the ones that, here's the functions that are most impaired, and here's the ones that seem to be least impaired. They're more often survive. And what's kind of nice is that you can order them, right? And they don't cluster particularly well. At least that's the impression one Blumenfeld gets. Right? So you can look for clusters. You've got a whole bunch of behavioral, cognitive features, and you can look for clustering between them and try and explore what might underline the clustering. Awfully messy, but you can kind of see how it might work. So how does this bear on the measurement problem? Well, let's think about water as an analog. So you've got 3 samples of a liquid. One of the samples is odorless, transparent, and drinkable, so it has the things that we pre-theoretically perhaps associate with water. Another has some of those things, but not others. It's toxic. And the third sample has none of those things, none of the pre-theoretical things that we associate with water. If we're just going on our pre-theoretical measures, we're going to say the first one's water, the second one, well, we're not so sure, and the third one isn't water. But that's not what we say once we've got a chemical theory of water in hand. We look for whether or not there's H2O involved, and we say that there is. But no, because it's a natural kind concept, what we're also tempted to say is, if it turns out that this satisfies the pre-theoretical markers, but doesn't satisfy the chemical analysis, it turns out to be XYZ, for example, some other chemical that produces odorless, transparent, and non-toxic liquid, then we say that actually it's not water. So interestingly, this shows ways in which the natural kind approach can override our pre-theoretical ascriptions of consciousness, right? Just as tests of water, tests of the presence of H2O, can extend and trump pre-theoretical tests for water, so too this can happen for consciousness. So the direction one goes is quite interesting at this point. It's not just that it can help with the difficult cases, but potentially it might lead us to override some of the pre-theoretical judgments we wanted to make about the presence of consciousness and the absence of consciousness in the iPhone. So Tononi's recently got himself into a lot of trouble with some people for suggesting that his theory of consciousness could underwrite descriptions of consciousness to iPhones. If you're employing a natural kind methodology, there's nothing in principle absurd about that idea. Right? I'm not saying he's actually gives us good evidence for that, but there's nothing absurd in principle. There's nothing methodologically absurd about that idea. Okay, so at this point, let me just raise some questions about how this relates to some earlier papers, and then I'm going to give you some reasons why I find the natural kind approach problematic. why I think there's deep problems with them. So I'm kind of interested here about whether the approaches that we've seen in the Earth yesterday, for example, some of the work that other people did, could be reconstructed according to this natural kind methodology. Is this what people kind of think they're doing when they're developing measures that look at neural integration, for example? If so, are they deploying the method appropriately, or is it sometimes that they're quick and dirty with the method? And if they're not using this, what exactly is the method? Is it perhaps a purely correlational method, which looks like it's pretty much the only alternative to a natural kind approach in town? So those are some questions which, if I'm asked to ask questions, if I'm allowed to ask questions of the panelists, those are the questions I would ask at that point. Okay, let me finish with the next few minutes discussion some challenges to the natural kind approach. There are lots of challenges, I think. Let me mention two ways in which I think it's problematic, or at least it faces serious challenges. Both challenges focus on the idea that consciousness is a natural kind concept. So that's the target of the approach. The first is I call the eliminativist challenge. So here's one way into it. Natural kind concepts look that there might turn out to fail to have any reference. So the classic example in the history of science, phlogiston, turned out that there just wasn't anything that satisfied the pre-theoretical description that we associated with it. It didn't pick out anything in the world. Right? We want to be eliminativist about that concept. And it looks like if you're treating consciousness as a natural kind concept, there's a sense in which it should be an open possibility, an epistemic possibility for you, that eliminativism should be on the cards in a sense. And is it? Well, one struggles to find people who are willing to regard eliminativism about consciousness as an open epistemic possibility. There are a few people. Georges Rey, for example, has gone into print defending eliminativism about consciousness. A few others now and again take it as a serious possibility. But most people, or many people, especially scientists working on this, don't think it's an open epistemic possibility. We're more sure of the existence of consciousness than we are of anything else, is a sentence you can find in many, many papers. And I think that, if that's where you want to start, if that view is epistemic bedrock, then you're not treating consciousness as a natural kind concept. So that's one challenge. A lot more to say about it. The challenge in a nutshell is, are we really prepared to take eliminativism with respect to consciousness seriously? If you're not, I guess I'm inclined to say I'm not, then that suggests that you're not thinking of it as a natural kind concept. Right? I am prepared to take eliminativism about, say, attention seriously. It's not clear to me that that concept will survive. Consciousness, I'm not so sure. Second challenge from first-person authority, which is, I suspect, this, for me anyway, it's the deeper of the two challenges, the more challenging of the two challenges. Here's my way into it. Suppose you look in the mirror one day, you notice that you seem to have the signs of hepatitis. Yellow eyes, you've got a fever, you're not feeling so good. You self-ascribe hepatitis to yourself. But you could be wrong. Even if you've got many of the superficial signs of hepatitis, if you don't have the virus associated with it, then you don't have hepatitis. Right? So you don't insist on first-person authority here. It's not really first-person authority, but your self-ascription is not authoritative. You hand over the authority to what the virologist says. Right? And that seems to be something that applies to natural kind concepts. In general, they don't seem to bring with them this kind of privileged first-person authority. But it's not clear we want to say that about consciousness. If you self-ascribe a conscious state, and then you've got some sort of empirical evidence based on what you take to be an underlying substrate of consciousness, you're going to be very reluctant, I think, to give up your first-person authority. And one way to think about this is that there's no fool's phenomenology in the way there is fool's hepatitis or fool's gold. Right? Things that have the superficial markers but don't have the underlying feature that accounts for the superficial markers. So, suppose you're somewhat persuaded or at least warmed up to the idea that consciousness, the concept, is not a natural kind concept. Then what kind of concept is it? Well, one idea that gets a lot of airplay in philosophy of mind at the moment is that it's what's called a phenomenal concept. Now, this idea gets talked about usually in connection with particular fine-grained concepts like the concept of experiencing red. but you can apply it to thinking about consciousness as such quite easily, it seems to me. What are phenomenal concepts? Well, the literature is divided on exactly how to think about them, but they're concepts that refer to their reference directly. They're inferentially isolated from functional and physical concepts, and they're experience dependent. Not everyone agrees that there are phenomenal concepts, that's controversial, but at least it's widely held that we've got a way of locking on to consciousness that's very, very different from the way we've got to locking on to natural kinds. So, where does this leave us? For me anyway, where does this leave me? Let me put it autobiographically. I think there's 3 options on the table. One is to embrace the natural kind method, grounded in a natural kind analysis of the concept of consciousness, and be prepared to bite some bullets on, for example, possibility of eliminativism, or at least, and first-person authority, right? Being prepared to downgrade that, which some people would argue we should anyway, but for many, myself included, that would be potentially biting some bullets. Or you find another way to tackle the measurement problem, try and get there through brute correlation. I don't have an argument that that's going to fail, but I think it's going to fail. I suspect that this is, in some sense, really the only game in town. Or you try and motivate the natural kind method without treating consciousness as a natural kind concept. You try and have your cake and eat it. You try and use the clustering, the nomological clustering of the things associated with consciousness as a test for the presence of consciousness, but you try and keep all the goodies associated with thinking of it as a phenomenal concept in terms of first-person authority. I don't know if that's a circle one's going to be able to square. I suspect not. I think there's a real tension in trying to deploy the method without committing yourself to treating the concept as a natural kind concept. But that's certainly one thing to think about. So, 31 minutes, let me end there.